Welcome back to Whose Body Is It? You are about to listen to part 2 of my conversation with the Deprogrammer XX. If you have not watched part 1, please do that before you listen to this episode. As I mentioned in the intro for part 1, this talk that we've broken up into 2 segments was initially recorded for a private group of vetted women who were interested in deprogramming from the trans agenda. This was recorded October 2020. Please keep in mind that this episode contains very explicit content, mentions of pedophilia, child abuse. Be aware of who is listening over your shoulder, and please take care of yourself after listening. The Deprogrammer and I are independent creators. We are not sponsored. We are not backed by corporations, and we certainly are not funded by NGOs created by transhumanist billionaires. So please consider supporting our channels. If you want to see more of this content, your financial donations directly impact our ability to create more regular content. And be sure to let me know your thoughts on this episode in the comment section.
I'm going to talk a little bit about Alfred Kinsey and just kind of go over the trajectory of how pro-pedophile movements have evolved over time. So I'm starting with Kinsey because this was like in the late 50s, early 60s. And he was a zoologist turned sexologist, and he's still hailed today as the father of the sexual revolution. His work was considered groundbreaking. And I remember years ago when Miley Cyrus came out as pansexual. I don't know if you remember that or if anyone remembers that, but there were a lot of pop left media outlets online that were promoting the Kinsey Institute because of her coming out. Because I think she either mentioned them or one way or another, it was like all over when she came out, Kinsey Institute, Kinsey Institute. And a few years after that, a friend of mine asked me if I'd ever heard of Alfred Kinsey. I was like, oh yeah, sure, the Kinsey scale guy, because I had used his work before. And the Kinsey scale, it's basically a scale that places heterosexuality on one end, homosexuality on the other end, and then it kind of tries to make a case that no one is heterosexual, to put sexuality on a spectrum. And I think that spectrum idea is really important because that's kind of been extrapolated to gender and now even to sex. And remember those images I showed in my presentation of the genderbread man and the gender unicorn and stuff? I really think that whoever made those images borrowed heavily from Kinsey's ideas. But yeah, anyways, so my friend asked me if I'd ever heard of Dr. Judith Reisman. And this woman painstakingly put together like all this expose on Kinsey's work. And she kind of uncovered that his research involved ritualized paid rape of infants and children. So obviously, as soon as I heard that, and this was kind of towards the end when I was questioning a lot of stuff anyways. But I kind of just dove right in and started researching this Kinsey guy. And yeah, so he published research that claimed that babies as young as 2 months old enjoy being manually and orally stimulated. And he recorded his research. And he alleged that there was even an orgasm of a 4-month-old female baby. I know this is so disgusting, but the babies, they even recorded in their research that the babies were crying, screaming, thrashing, scratching, and just like otherwise trying to resist. And Kinsey took all those behaviors and described them as sexual responses and claimed that they could be used as evidence of an orgasm. It's all, obviously really gruesome stuff. It's just going to get worse also as I go on with this kind of stuff. But he basically promoted the idea that sex play with children is essentially harmless and that children can give consent. And then another thing that he did, which is not totally to the topic, but definitely relevant, is he promoted this dichotomy that American women are either sexually repressed or highly promiscuous. So one or the other. So that was his classification for women. Okay, so gonna go into NAMBLA now. This moving into kind of like the tail end of the 70s. We had NAMBLA, it's the North American Man Boy Love Association, and it was also created to push the legalization of pedophilia. Their website's still up and running. Anybody can pull it up, and they have all these like essays on their website where they talk about how to groom and like have sex with boys, and they claim it's all fictional, but I mean, obviously it's not. And then disturbingly, just like most pro pedophile organizations, they take up the claim that young boys want and enjoy sexual attention. There's a documentary out there about NAMBLA. It's called Chicken Hawk, and I definitely recommend this. It's disgusting, but it's highly informative and insightful when it comes to learning how these predators think and how they target their victims. So the film follows around like several child predators and just allows them to kind of just speak freely about their fantasies of child rape. And the documentary itself shows how NAMBLA was able to achieve some mainstream success within the mainstream homosexual movement and amongst organizations. And they even have this like little bit where they show a clip of NAMBLA marching at a gay pride parade in Washington, D.C. And one of the organizers talks about how they're doing it on purpose because they want to be seen as part of the rainbow. And obviously not all, I'm not saying that everybody at the gay pride parade endorsed that behavior. I know there was definitely people who spoke out about it, but I don't think LGBT people, especially gay and bisexual males who have like a far greater institutional power than women and lesbians, I don't think they've done enough to speak out against the ways that child sexualization is being normalized under the rainbow. If they had been speaking up about this all along and, you know, clearly disidentifying with these behaviors, then maybe we wouldn't be where we are today. You know, we're like desperately trying to backtrack up this slippery slope that we've already been shoved down, you know. But I think it's important to note that it's NAMBLA, not NAGLA. You know, it's the National Association for Man Boy Love, not woman girl love. You know, there's no, to my knowledge, there's no female organizations that are dedicated towards pedophilia, towards girls or boys for that matter, you know. So obviously, I'm not discounting the fact that women engage in perpetuating these forms of abuse, but when we're looking at the history of these open movements, they're mostly headed by men. Okay, the next thing I'm going to talk about is Kinderladen. So in Germany, they had these experimental anti-authoritarian schools. That's what they called them, anti-authoritarian schools. Hurts my heart as an anti-authoritarian because that's not my idea of anti-authoritarianism. But anyways, so in Germany, they had these experimental schools called Kinderladens, and there was like routine ritualized sexual abuse in these schools they're called. And it's all been well documented by the adults who created the schools themselves and also by the adult child abuse survivors who were subjected to these like experiments. There's a lot of narratives online that you can find. It's really, really disturbing to read about and to talk about. It's uncomfortable to talk about, but we really have to know this history. So the schools were kind of like homeschool communes where the parents were sometimes engaged in the teaching. And in these schools, they had adults watching pornography with children and this was on a daily activity, reading pornographic magazines and books together, simulating sex acts and acting out sex acts. And all of this was done under the guise of child sexual liberation and teaching the child to release their so-called inhibitions. So obviously, most of the people involved in these schools were pedophiles who wanted to access children to abuse, but not all of them, you know, not all of those people were there for that reason. So a lot of the parents that were involved in this stuff came from the communist left at that time. And that's not hyperbolic. That's direct. You can look this up. This is who was doing this, or that's where these things were cropping up. So not all of the parents were ready to accept these, like what were called teaching strategies. They themselves had to be groomed into participating. One thing that I've learned with researching this is that a lot of the parents were kind of trained to, any parent that, especially women, that were concerned about these teaching methods, they were groomed to repress their own moral qualms, and they were told to focus on the idea that children are being unfairly repressed in their sexuality by a rigid, restrictive society and all these social norms being imposed on them. And if they weren't being repressed in this way, well, then the kids would just choose to freely engage in sexual activity with adults. So basically, they were saying that the reason why kids weren't freely choosing to engage in sexual behavior was because they were too like inhibited and restricted and repressed by society. Everything that I've read about these schools, it's all very cult-like to me. But yeah, the way that the parents who weren't comfortable with the child abuse were made to feel ashamed of themselves and like treated as these bad, repressive people, that just reminds me of the way that I myself and others have been treated for speaking out about the drag kids and the trans kids and drag queen story time. You know, we've been harassed and slandered and accused of being the oppressive monsters because it's us, we're these horrible people. We just won't let children be themselves. And one of the more disturbing but enlightening essays that I read had this narrative from a mother who was part of one of these communes, and she said that she started to kind of be harassed and assaulted by young boys, and they were reaching up her skirt and like grabbing on her pubic hair and pulling it. And that in itself is like messed up and shocking enough, but this is the part that I found, just this is what we need to learn, I guess, because she talked about in that narrative that she didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to respond because she didn't want to seem like she was like a repressive force, you know, or that she was somehow inhibited. She didn't want to be the person that was like inhibiting the children's you know. So even though she says in this narrative that she didn't like it, she was still allowing it to occur because of this like thought control that she had going on that said don't intervene. If you intervene, that's bad. So finally she claims that she spoke up and said like, that hurts, I don't like it. So if we can believe this woman, and I'm not saying necessarily that we should, maybe we shouldn't, like what she was involved in, but it does kind of demonstrate this thought pattern that goes on in the minds of people who engage in child sexual abuse and the people that excuse it. And it kind of shows like what they want us to think when we're confronted with these types of behaviors. And I think a lot of people on the left, especially those that identify under the LGBT rainbow community, are allowing themselves to excuse behavior that they know is dangerous. And they're allowing themselves to excuse it because they're scared. And they have a fear of being seen and labeled as some kind of bigot or phobe. You know, it's the same thing that's being done to stop us from speaking out about transgenderism as it relates to like women's rights being taken away. It's the same mechanism. So yeah, just what I get out of this whole, the Kinderladen thing, and there's a lot of information out there about the Kinderladens anyway. I'm like disturbed by the stuff that I've learned about it. But what I get out of reading about the Kinderladens is that adults that were involved with this, they were totally unable to differentiate that their own like ideological expectations, their own political expectations, their own beliefs about anti-authoritarianism, they couldn't differentiate that between like from their own sense of right and wrong. You know what I mean? Like they allowed the ideology to completely override what they knew was right or wrong. And I think that that's going on now. And I'm going to speak a little bit about that in a minute. I don't want to touch on pi because that's really important. And there's a woman on Twitter. Her handle is at Dr. M, I think it is. And she's done a lot of really good work collating a lot of information about pi. So I definitely recommend for people to look her up. But yeah, PI was operative for about 10 years in the mid 70s to 80s, and the acronym stands for Pedophile Information Exchange. Really disturbing. What exactly were they exchanging? I'm sure they were exchanging, child sexual abuse imagery. But on the front, like openly, they were publishing materials talking about sexual liberation of children, arguing that sexual rights of children are human rights. So where we heard that before, trans rights are human rights. Child sexual liberation is a human right, they were saying. They were arguing that children, like, not only can they consent to sex, but like that they should be able to. And if they aren't able to consent to sex, then their human rights are being violated. That's how this was all framed. So they were campaigning for children's sexuality. Oh, and this was in the UK. I don't know if I mentioned that, but this was in the UK. They wanted the government to like totally axe the age of consent, or at least lower it. And they promoted sex with children as young as 4. And they also came to the defense of accused pedophiles. They had a magazine called Understanding Pedophilia, and it featured children in provocative clothing and poses alongside like avant-garde art and like, academic style articles. And honestly, the way that magazine was organized, it really reminds me of the type of materials that I've seen used, the type of magazines that drag kids have been featured in, especially like Desmond is Amazing, who I'm going to talk about in a little bit, but he's been featured in a lot of magazines, an 11-year-old drag queen, in a lot of magazines that sound just like the way I just described this last magazine. You know what I mean? Even though they don't openly say they're reporting pedophilia, it's still the same type of formatting going on. It's the same language being used, everything. And PI was not a fringe group at all. They were so institutionalized. They had a phone number, and the line, it led to inside the Home Office. And in the UK, the Home Office, it's like it's like a government department. It's responsible supposedly for law and order. So they had an actual pedophile, an actual self-identified pedophile in the office to answer the line and tell people where they could go to the next like PI meeting to talk about normalizing and decriminalizing child sex abuse. They were totally seen as a legitimate voice of an oppressed sexual minority. And they were included by and respected by a number of well-established groups and organizations. I'll talk about Tom O'Carroll. He was a co-founder of PI and another self-admitted pedophile. He was jailed at some point for 2 years. Well, I bring him up specifically because last year, I think it was last year in 2019, he wrote a blog post about the 11-year-old drag kid, Desmond is Amazing. And I've got 3 videos about him on my YouTube channel for anybody that needs the background info on this kid. It's all on what's being done to this poor child. It's all there. Tom O'Carroll, co-founder of PI, self-admitted pedophile, he wrote a blog post saying that the 11-year-old drag kid, Desmond is Amazing, is hot and sexy. And he came right out and said what those of us who've been protesting this whole idea of drag kids all along, what we've been thinking, he said it. He said there's no way that the concept of drag kids is not sexual in nature. He broke the whole thing down and explained how it is sexual, and we know that. So now he's coming out, he's admitted it. And this whole thing with drag kids is, it's been met with a lot of resistance, not enough, in my opinion, but this whole time I've been watching all of the propaganda that comes out specifically about Desmond, and his mother, Wendy, was totally demented, but she repeats the same talking point over and over again that comes straight out of these pedophile organizations. She tries to instill in the minds of the people that support this behavior that it's only wrong for people to interpret his clothing, the behavior, and the dancing. It's only wrong for us to interpret that as sexual. Like, we're the bad ones because we say it's sexual, even though it's obviously overtly sexual. And it's like, it's not like she's wrong as the mother to promote that behavior and put it on display for adults to see and to like pay for. The companies, the corporations, the outlets that promote that, they're not the wrong ones. It's us. We're the bad ones. And she's repeatedly accused us, like the people that critique what she's doing, as having an agenda. And she claims that we are the pedophiles and that we have a pedophilic ideation and we have pedophilic behaviors ourselves. And like, that's why we're so obsessed with pedophilia and like seeing a problem when there's nothing, you know? It's just like, it's mind blowing to me how she keeps repeating this talking point, and it straight up comes out of these pro pedophile talking points and the pedophile manifesto called After the Fall. Like, I'm going to talk about that in a second, but I think this idea, this reversal from these pro pedophilia proponents, it's really, really common. They just like feign this ignorance, you know, what? Oh, this is all so innocent. You're the one suggesting it because you're perverted. You're a sick pedophile. There was actually a radical feminist named Eileen Fairweather that she wrote about her experience with pro-pedophile propaganda during the era of like Pi and Nambla. And specifically, she wrote about Tom O'Carroll, because I guess like way back then she was asked to, I don't know, read or review one of his books that was pro-pedophile. And she actually said she was too scared at the time, all the way back then. She was too scared to publish any writing in response to like denounce the piece. She said that she and her contemporaries, like this is what she has said currently. I think it was in like 2014. She published an article talking about that time period, saying that her and her contemporaries on the radical left, they lacked the courage to be branded homophobic. And when I read that, I'm just like, wow, she's totally right. And like, if it was difficult back then to be branded homophobic, imagine, you know, like we're totally validated and recognizing that it's like a tough thing to do now. Because the moment you start speaking out about any of this, or the minute you say anything about LGBT and pedophilia or transgender and pedophilia in the same breath, it's like, oh, you're a homophobe, you're a transphobe, you're a bigot, like you're pushing an agenda. But yeah, she said that back then the pedo movement was so enmeshed in the gay movement that if you said anything about being against child sexual liberation, then you're just like automatically branded a homophobe and like anti-gay. So we have the exact same intimidation tactics being used now with the transgender movement and all these pro-pedophile ideas and behaviors that have kind of snuck in under the cover of the rainbow and like the civil rights issue. And the fear tactics are definitely still working, you know, but we have to break out of that control grid of fear because we just have to. I don't care anymore. We're at the point where it's just like, if we don't stand up and scream about this now, what's going to be accepted tomorrow? I'm going to talk about the After the Fall manifesto. And it's something that comes up in some of my videos. So After the Fall manifesto, a guide to destroying pedophobia in the 21st century. That's the whole title of it. And actually, Dr. M, who I mentioned earlier, she also has some stuff on Twitter about After the Fall, and I think she makes really good observations about it that I'm not going to go into here. To give some background on it, it's on the Boy Wiki website. So that's a website that pedos use to congregate and discuss how to continue grooming children and also to groom the adult public. So on that website, and I show this in my video, there's like the blue triangle within a triangle, like spiral symbol that is used to represent what they call man-boy love. And this logo it's been popularized a lot recently because there was a declassified FBI document that went out showing the logo and saying that it is a symbol used by pedophiles to like kind of signal to one another. So anyways, that's a whole nother discussion, but the manifesto itself like focuses not really on how to groom individual children or individual people, but more so like how to groom us on like a societal level or cultural level. And I discussed this manifesto in my video called Kinder. So the Kinder was a marketing campaign run by the company that owns Grindr. It's a gay male hookup app. And when I was researching this Kinder campaign, I found it to be really, really suspicious in its intention because it seemed to be borrowing tactics from the pro-pedophile groups. And the thing that initially got me investigating it was the word kind, because like I saw the word kind in the After the Fall pedophile manifesto, and I remembered seeing it in there, and they labeled it a pro-pedophile power word. So the authors of the manifesto, they flat out advocate piggybacking on the quote successes of the LGBT community, and they especially single out the transgender community. They say he who controls the language controls the debate, which obviously that's so true because that's what's happening right now with the transgender quote unquote debate. And now they're trying to take away the word woman and take away all the words that we use to define ourselves. So they've taken away the words. Now they control the debate. And this is exactly what they say in the pedophile manifesto, that they need to do the same exact thing. And they pose the question to the reader. They say, why do you think transgender people insist you use their preferred pronouns? So preferred pronouns, that's not really used as much anymore. Now it's just pronouns. These are my pronouns and you must accept them. Years ago, I remember it was preferred. Like, I prefer if you refer to me with these pronouns. Now it's like hard line, like do it or you're a bigot, you're a TERF. So I think it's really interesting that in that section of the manifesto where they're talking about this specifically, like the pro-pedo and pro-trans movement, they keep on using she and her pronouns. They're basically showing that in their minds, the hypothetical pedophobe, as they call us, is a woman. So they have all these suggestions about different language that pro-pedophiles should be using against people like us to say that we're pedophobes, we're intolerant, we're backwards, regressive, ancient, we lack compassion and tolerance. It straight up says to frame us as ignorant, hateful, repressive, bigots. Again, this is exactly what's being done to us when it comes to women speaking out about the colonization of our sex-based legal and social rights by trans rights. It's the same tactic. So the so-called manifesto proposes this idea that people who oppose pedophilia, we should be identified, branded, and labeled as bigots and Nazis, and that we should be isolated from our social networks. So I'd say that this is actually working if you consider that most women who are branded TERFs are also critical of or directly, openly oppositional to the normalization of pedophilia in society. So maybe they don't have to directly attack the pedophobe if they can just attack the TERF. So the manifesto openly discusses how people fear the idea of becoming a social outcast or pariah. And like they openly say that people will learn to override their beliefs and their intuition in order to continue to be, like part of the in-group and to avoid persecution. The manifesto, it also says, this is something that I see a lot of happening now too when it comes to the trans agenda. Like it says to isolate gay males who are opposed to pedophilia and kind of portray them as like, oh, they're out of touch, they're white, they're wealthy, they only care about themselves. It's the same thing that a lot of the trans activists say, like on the rare occasion that a gay man does speak up against the trans agenda, they have the same thing. And the manifesto, it cites Kinsey's work as supposed evidence that sexual relationships between kids and adults are harmless and should be accepted. All the fears that we have about predatory behavior are valid, and we need to recognize that as such and not be scared to speak out because our fears are coming from a real place. Especially when you see things like this, like it's obvious that there is something to be concerned about. And, I think about all this stuff with drag queen story time. It's been I've researched it a lot, thought about it a lot, and it's like really weighed on me a lot because, just other like personal reasons. But yeah, our fears about predatory behavior are totally valid. And I think anyone who takes an honest look at any of the posts that I made on Instagram, that kind of like, you can just look through the thing and just see, like, obviously there's predator, 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 predator. There's something going on. Like, it's demanding our attention. We have to do something about it. So I'm almost done here, but I really want to talk more about like how I see this, like, these pro pedophile rhetoric coming up today. So most pedophiles, before they actually abuse a kid or start to, like act out on their impulses, they start by gradually desensitizing and grooming the child to more and more inappropriate behavior. And I think that we have to stop this by creating a zero tolerance attitude to child sexual abuse and working to fight back against this culture that enables and encourages pedophiles. And I know that that's not happening. I know that actually the opposite is happening. In leftist organizing spaces, there's all this just total impunity for men that are rapists or pedophiles. They're just like continuously propped up in these organizing spaces. And I saw it myself, which I will get into in a minute. So yeah, I just want to say a little bit more about Drag Queen Story Hour, because it feels like when I was reading about the Kinderladens, it just, to me, I'm like, wow, there's so much similarities going on here. So at this point, it's not just speculation about pedophiles being involved in Drag Queen Storytime. It's like a fact that known sex offenders have been in libraries and in other places speaking and reading to children. And I think isn't it strange in a country that's supposed to be like the best in the world and stuff, where we have child literacy rates falling, instead of like actually teaching kids how to read? The libraries, like the American Library Association, has made it their mission to like prioritizing all this programming with these hypersexualized men that, they're making a cartoon mockery out of women, teaching children these full-blown lies about biology and grooming them to overcome their discomfort. Because, discomfort is intolerance. And I've seen that a lot. And that's very, very dangerous, to teach children that they should override their personal discomfort. No. So there's been a number of cases now where libraries, they didn't run background checks before inviting these drag queens to read to kids. And obviously, I'm not saying that all drag queens are pedophiles. Like, I hate that I even have to say that, but no, I'm not saying that. But there was a library, I think it was in Texas, where they invited a man to come read to the kids in drag. His name was Alberto Garza. He actually was convicted of assaulting an 8-year-old boy. And he was allowed to be in the library talking to kids about sex and gender, and grooming them to accept these lies that have very dangerous real-world implications. There was another drag queen, I can't remember where this was. Videos or pictures went viral for a while, so I know you can find this out there if you look it up. There was another drag queen where he was reading to the kids. He had, the typical like hyper feminized costumery on and this really short dress. And he had stockings on, and he's got his legs spread wide open, and he has no underwear on, just his genitals on full display. And there's kids like sitting feet away from his genitals, literally, and just like literally looking up his skirt. Okay. And then he said that he accidentally forgot his panties.
I remember this. Yeah.
Yeah. And like all of it just kind of got swept under the rug by all these parents that support the drag queen story time. And you would think that instead of dismissing that, they'd be like, oh my gosh, like we need to make sure that this never happens again. I didn't see any of that coming from the supporters of this. Like instead they just doubled down and keep on saying that, oh yeah, these people, they're, you know, they're right-wing Christian bigots and they're so repressive and intolerant and they don't want the kids to be themselves and they're homophobic and transphobic and da da da. And I don't know, it's so reminiscent to me of what was going on with these with the Kinderladens and Germany's like history of these like leftist, anti-authoritarian, like experimental commune schools. And like that story that I had mentioned earlier of that woman, that adult woman saying that she didn't even know how to tell a child no, you know, that her own like intuition had been overrode by these ideologies. That's happening right now. And people think that this is by mistake. It's not. It's all by design, and there's a clear trajectory here.
Yeah, like you spoke to the fear of appearing homophobic, the fear of appearing transphobic,
Right.
now is like most people's priority, more so than protecting their children.
Right.
And all the parents who are unknowingly grooming their children for,
and they themselves are being groomed.
Yeah.
Like
Right.
the parents themselves,
Right.
they have already been groomed.
Right.
Like it's either you yourself are a full-blown like secret pedophile or you've been groomed. There's really
Right.
no, or you oppose it. That's it. That's all that there is for options.